This sikha is actually something where the Rebbe, in this week's parsha, we talk about the mitzvah of Viduy on Averis. So the question is, it seems to be that when you read in the Sefer Hamitzvos, when you read in the Rambam, it doesn't talk about Teshuvah in the Moinei HaMitzvahs. It doesn't talk about Teshuvah as being a mitzvah. It seems to refer to Viduy as being a mitzvah. And different Mefarshim the Rebbe is going to analyze, explain different ways of looking or explaining the Rambam. What does it mean when the Rambam seems to leave out Teshuvah as a mitzvah and talks about Viduy, confession, as a mitzvah? And the Rebbe is going to explain all three opinions according to Nigla, and then he's going to explain each one of them what they mean according to Chassidus. So it's a very interesting analysis of the idea of Teshuvah based on the Nigla perspective. Now, by the way, it's important to note there is two distinct svarim of the Rambam. One is the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, known as Yad HaChazaka, 14 volumes, where it's like a Shulchan Aruch. Every mitzvah is analyzed and said all the details and so on. Then there's another Sefer, which we know the Rebbe also brought into the Takana of Limud Rambam, for those that can't learn 3 parakim a day, or those that can't learn 1 parak a day, they at least learn the Sefer Hamitzvos. The Sefer Hamitzvos is literally, it tells you what are the mitzvahs. We mentioned this before, there are the Moinei HaMitzvahs. There are certain Rishonim that their thing was to count the mitzvahs. And there's different ways of counting it. Everybody agrees that there's 613 mitzvahs. The question is, how do you count them? And the Rambam has a whole bunch of rules called Sharashim about what's considered a mitzvah and what's not considered a mitzvah. We'll touch on that a little bit in the Sikha. There's other Moinei HaMitzvahs. There's the Rambam, there's the Smak, there's the Chinuch, etc., etc.
So it means there's more than 613?
No. There's 613. The question is, what are the rules for counting a mitzvah? So, for example, just to give an example of what the Rambam excludes, there is the Leviim in the Midbar had to have a complete shave of their entire body. Or in the Midbar, we weren't allowed to collect the man on Shabbos. Or in the Midbar, we didn't have the mitzvah of, or we had to collect only an omer for each person of the month. That's not a mitzvah l'doidus. That's not counted as part of the 613 mitzvahs. It was a mitzvah of the Eibishter, but it's not considered. It's not a mitzvah l'doidus. It doesn't apply. It's not one of the 613. Anyway, so we're going to first explain how the Rambam speaks about the mitzvah of Viduy, and then what's going on with the mitzvah of Teshuvah and Sefer Hamitzvos. Then we're eventually going to bring in what does the Rambam say in his Yad HaChazaka, in the big Sefer, where he analyzes and breaks down the mitzvahs into detail. So let's see it inside. Kasava Rambam b'Sefer HaMitzvos, and it's Mitzvahs Esa Ayin Gimel. You should remember this from what we're learning in Mitzvahs Viduy Teshuvah. Shetzivonu lisvades ala avoynes v'achatoyim shechatonu lefnei hakel v'leimar oisam im hatshuvah v'zeu haviduy v'hu amroi. This is what Hashem says in the Torah in this week's parsha. V'hisvadu es chatasam asher chatu. So that's where we know that there's a mitzvah of Viduy. V'yadu ha'shayla lam v'loy mana ha'rambam binyan ha'mitzvahs in the Sefer HaMitzvos where he enumerates mitzvah ayin gimel. What's the mitzvah 73? Viduy. But he doesn't say that there's a mitzvah number something or other of Teshuvah. El mitzvah Viduy v'loy mana mitzvah Teshuvah. U'metzinu b'za gimel b'yudim. Shitas HaMinchas Chinuch to explain why the Rambam doesn't consider it. So he says an amazing word. He says the Teshuvah ain't a mitzvah. Viduy is a mitzvah. Teshuvah is not a mitzvah. Listen to the reason why. Mitzvahs esezu de Viduy have kaharbe mitzvahs mataryag she'einoi mitzvah lasois oisha loy lasois Rakasiya al toyar kach v'kach nechshav mitzvah k'moy gerishin v'toyin v'nitin. There is no mitzvah, for example, to get a divorce. There is no mitzvah that two people should come to Beis Din with a dispute about something. But the mitzvah is, if a husband and wife want to separate, So then the mitzvah is that you have to do it in such a manner by giving a get, or the mitzvah is that if two people have an argument, so then they have to come to Beis Din, and this will be the halacha if they complain like this, if they say like that, and so on. So the same thing, the chinuch is going to say about the mitzvah of Teshuvah, an amazing thing, that there's no mitzvah to do Teshuvah. But if you do want to do Teshuvah, then you got to say Viduy. Let's see it inside. The dinei mitzvah im yasakach yekach hava mitzvah. That's in other cases, like we said about divorce and about toyin v'nitten. Hachinami da Torah amra im yaset Teshuvah. Then how do you do it? Here is the directions. Yi al Torah kach lisvadis cholu ubekach. If he does Viduy, then Teshuvah se mekubelas. Aval einay mevatel shum mitzvah im eina oiset Teshuvah. Again, this is not something that everybody's going to agree with. It's definitely not that way going to come out from the Alter Rebbe and Tanya. And sure, it's open in Gersa Teshuvah there. It's a mitzvah. Not only that, but we'll bring proof from the Rambam itself that it's a mitzvah. So even though the Minchas Chinuch is explaining this in the Rambam, whatever. So he says, Ki zeh eine mitzvah klal rak kemoy gerish v'adoymen. Just like there's no mitzvah to divorce. Sha'atoyra kos v'dina ha-mitzvah im yirtze sha'avoyni yechuper yasa tshuva al Torah kach v'kach. You don't have to do tshuva. He used an interesting expression, eine mevatel shum mitzvah. There are certain things that if a person doesn't do, he's called mevatel, mitzvah sasi. If a person doesn't read Kriyas Shema in the morning, and he doesn't read Kriyas Shema by night, he was mevatel the mitzvah esa of Kriyas Shema. If a person Chas Shalom didn't put on tefillin, he was mevatel the mitzvah esa of tefillin. But let's say if a person did an aveda and he didn't do tshuva, he was, according to the chinuch, he was not mevatel the mitzvah esa. It's only that the Torah tells you, you want to have a kapara, the Torah gives you an idea for a kapara, you could do tshuva. How do you do tshuva? You got to say Viduy. But there's no chiyuv min ha-Torah to do tshuva, to have your aveda atoned for. It's amazing. It's an amazing thing to hear, but that's the way the chinuch learns pshat in the Sefer Hamitzvos of the Rambam. And actually, he tries to bring a proof from the Rambam in the Yad HaChazaka also. The original thing is the Sefer Hamitzvos mentions only Viduy, not tshuva. Then he's going to bring a proof from the words of the Rambam in the Yad HaChazaka and Mishnah Torah itself. Kain gam loshna Rambam bereish hilchos tshuva shekosov kol mitzvos shebetoyra chulu. If a person didn't do them or transgressed, kishe yasa tshuva. You see the emphasis on the chof shin. Yeah. When he will do tshuva, v'yoshev mechetei chayiv leisvadis m'pnei hakel baruch hu viduy zeh mitzvos aseh. He doesn't say that the tshuva is a mitzvah aseh. He says the viduy is a mitzvah aseh. The mevur bedvarav. This is a quote from the Sefer HaChinuch. The ein ha-tshuva mitzvah aseh. The loikos of mitzvah aseh sheyasa tshuva. All he wrote is rak im bol aseh mitzvah aseh sheyisvada b'piv. That is the shit of the Chinuch. Why the Rambam does not say the mitzvah of tshuva in Sefer HaMitzvos. Another view, Beis. Another explanation. Gam la Rambam yesh mitzvah v'chiyuv lasis tshuva. V'yesh loymar, we know that it says in the Torah v'isvadu chatasam in this week's parsha. If you're going to tell me it's a mitzvah aseh, you're going to find a pasuk in the Torah. So he's now explaining what is the pasuk in the Torah that tells us that it's a mitzvah aseh to do tshuva. So he says v'yesh loymar shatzivu b'Torah al mitzvah tshuva nichlal b'kasav umaltem es orlas levavchem v'arpachem loitakshu oid. In other words, you're doing something that's also for the future, Kabbalah al-Haba, which is a crucial part of Mitzvah of Teshuvah. Shepirushay sivui lamol salev ulahasir es kashias ha'orev sheyesh nekvar, and instead you have to change your ways. Now the Rebbe says in the footnote, but this doesn't have to be only a case of when a person did an Avera. It could be a general hardness of the heart, an insensitivity to mitzvahs. But it includes also the idea of tshuva. So also in footnote 4 he says, isn't there a better pasuk? It says, "V'shavta adavai lakecha." You will return to Hashem your God. So if it says "V'shavta adavai lakecha," isn't that an open pasuk, a mitzvah asa of tshuva? So if you look over there, it's talking about in a way what's called a sipur dvarim. The Torah is telling you what will happen to the Yidden when they are amongst the nations. They will be in exile, and they will do such, and this will happen to them, and then they will return to Hashem your God. It doesn't say that there's a mitzvah that you should do so. So therefore, from that pasuk, "V'shavta davai lakecha," it's not a mitzvah. But from this pasuk, "Umaltem asalos avavchem," it's considered a mitzvah. But that's a side thing, where we learn it out from. Regardless of where we learn it out from, the other Mefarshim learn that Ella shemitzvah zu eina, it's a mitzvah asay, Ella eina nimnes b'minyan taryag mitzvahs. There is some mitzvahs that even though they're mitzvahs asay, they're not counted as one of the 613 mitzvahs. And that's why it's not in the Sefer Hamitzvos of the Rambam. Why is that? Lefi shehim atzivuyim hakolim ha'toira kulam she'einam b'minyan taryag mitzvahs k'mo shebir harambam b'Sefer Hamitzvos shaloi shoyrish revi. Like we said, in the beginning of Sefer Hamitzvos, the Rambam places rules. What do I consider part of the 613? What don't I consider? He has everything. Everything is mathematical by the Rambam. Has to be clear cut. Why do I consider A mitzvah and B I don't consider a mitzvah? So the Rambam has a rule when he enumerates all of his rules, it's called Shoyrish Revi. The fourth set of rules is that the reason that there's certain things that it says, and we're going to have this soon on the other side of the page, more details. Sometimes the Torah will tell you, keep the mitzvahs. Keep the mitzvahs. There's no extra mitzvah to keep the mitzvahs. It's a general thing. It's called a tzivui koilel. We'll have more examples of that soon. But the point is, the Rambam does not consider a tzivui koilel as a mitzvah by itself. So Teshuvah itself is also, it's a tzivui koilel. It's like, if you messed up on the mitzvahs, you got to fix up the mitzvahs. It's not a particular mitzvah that's one of the 613 mitzvahs. It's like a general thing. Keep the mitzvahs. The same thing. A general thing, you messed up in the mitzvahs, do tshuva. But it's not a separate one of the 613 mitzvahs. Vadarei ikra tshuva hu, k'ma shekosva Rambam, maya tshuva hu, sheyazei v'achoyte chetei, v'yasiroi machshavtei, v'yigmar b'liboi shlo yaseu oid. Obaloshna Rabbeinu Azakin b'geres ha-tshuva, mitzvahs ha-tshuva min ha-Torah, hi azivas ha-chet belvad, Dahainu sheyigmar beliboy belev shalom labal yoshuv oid lekisla limroid b'malchusi yisbarach lo yaver oid mitzvahs hamelach hasu shalom hein b'mitzvahs asay v'hein b'mitzvahs lois asay v'nimtza she'ein hatshuva ela inyan shekabolas mitzvahs. What's the main point that the Rambam says? Or what's the main point according to the Alter Rebbe? I am saying, from now on, I'm going to be your servant. So it's just like when we're told, keep the mitzvahs. It's not a separate mitzvah. Same thing. Teshuvah means I recommit again to keep the mitzvahs. I'm recommitting myself again to keep the mitzvahs. That's not a separate mitzvah. It's not one of the 613 mitzvahs. Shemekabel olav l'kaim taryag mitzvahs. V'im kein him mi'atzivuyim ha'koilelim ki ein ba chidush u'maisa miyuchad she'eina nichlo b'kiyam shar ha'mitzvahs u'b'loshna Rambam lo tziva lasis dover zulas mashi yadanu. In that Shoyrish Haravi he says that he didn't command us something except or in addition to what we know. In other words, what's called another one of the 613 mitzvahs? He tells you tefillin without that mitzvah. You wouldn't know to put on tefillin. He tells us not to eat treif without that mitzvah. You wouldn't know that. Everything is a chiddush. That's called one of the mitzvahs aseh. Now the mitzvahs lois aseh. When it's something we didn't know until the Torah tells us to do it. But the Torah wants us to keep the mitzvahs. So just recommitting and saying, I'm going to do the mitzvahs now after I messed up, that's not something new. It's just like the general commitment to do the mitzvahs. Nothing new came over here. That's what he means over here. We always know we're supposed to do the mitzvahs. We know we're supposed to commit to the mitzvahs. So what to make a difference if I make that commitment after I did an Aveda, or I have that commitment because I never did an Aveda? It's the same thing. There's nothing new. It's not like it's telling us now to put on film, which I didn't know before he told me to put on film. He tells me to put up a mezuzah, which I didn't know to do before he told me to put up a mezuzah. To commit to the mitzvahs, that's something that's not new with the mitzvah of Teshuvah. The Rambam gives all types of examples. I thought he was bringing the examples over here. The Rambam brings all types of examples over there in that Shoydish. He says, for example, it says, Kedoshim Tiyu. It says in the Pasuk, Kedoshim Tiyu, V'skadishtem v'yistem Kedoshim. That's not a separate mitzvah. All it means is that all of these things I told you to do, don't do this, don't do that, don't do arayis, don't eat treif, and all these things, these are the things that I'm telling you have to do to be Kaddish. And as mitzvah say tishmoidu, b'chokoi say telechu, all these things are not specific mitzvahs that he's telling us a specific thing, therefore it's not one of the 613. V'lachein mana Rambam rak mitzvahs viduy b'minyan ha-mitzvahs. Ki viduy, that is a chiddush. The commitment, that's always there. That's always something a person has to do. He has to be committed to Hashem. He has to be committed to doing the mitzvahs. Whether he did an Aveda beforehand or he didn't do an Aveda beforehand. But we didn't know that once a person messes up, then he has to do something with his mouth. That's a chiddush. That's something new. That's called one of the Tariag mitzvahs. That's not Teshuvah. I mean, Viduy is... We're going to talk about that in a minute. The way we're looking at it now, Teshuvah is one thing, Viduy is another thing. The Hainu Achiyuv Levate Besvasav Gemiras Halev Lazev Chulo. So you're right. Even in the parentheses, you see, he's expressing with his mouth that commitment that he has that he's leaving the Avedas. Still in all, Hu Maisa Meyuchad. It's still some type of specific action. She'eina Nichlo B'Shar Mitzvahs HaTorah. But now, in Gimel, in the third biur, he's going to explain another way of looking at it, and that is the way you were starting to say, that really Viduy and Teshuvah are really part of the same mitzvah. They're two halves of the same mitzvah. But the Rambam's approach is, when there's a mitzvah that involves action, or doing something, and there's a part of the mitzvah that involves thing that has to do with the heart, with the mind, so the Rambam is going to count the action part of the mitzvah. And since Teshuvah and Viduy are really part of the same mitzvah, but Teshuvah is in the heart and Viduy is how you express it, so he's telling you the aspect of Viduy. But it doesn't mean that Teshuvah is not a mitzvah. Teshuvah is part of that mitzvah of Viduy. Let's see it inside.
But this paragraph, he's saying that it's not or it is. It is a Maisa Meyuchad she'eini nechol b'sham mitzvahs, but Viduy is. What the last line is going on, Teshuvah or Viduy?
The last, which part? That's Viduy. That's why Viduy is counted as a mitzvah. But Teshuvah is a separate inyan. According to that pshat, Teshuvah is a separate inyan, and you have to have Viduy. You have to tell you about Viduy because you wouldn't know about Viduy. That's a chiddush.
So what's she'eini nechol b'sham mitzvahs? What's not? The
Viduy. We're saying that any mitzvah that's part of, included in the Torah, you don't have to say. You only have to say something that's a new chiddush. Right. So Viduy is a chiddush. That's why Viduy is enumerated as one of the 613 mitzvahs in Sefer Hamitzvos. Our question was that the Rambam in Sefer Hamitzvos, in mitzvah number 73, he brings the mitzvah of Viduy, but he doesn't say anywhere about the mitzvah of Teshuvah. So I'll tell you why. Teshuvah is a mitzvah kelelas, so therefore it's not possible to count it as one of the 613. Viduy is a chiddush. Viduy is something new to tell us, you know what, when you're doing Teshuvah, you got to do it with Viduy.
What's not? It is.
You remember he said...
That goes back to Teshuvah.
Eina nichlo, that means...
It's not
a mitzvah kelelas. It's something new. And since it's something new, you gotta give it a number. You gotta tell the Alter Rebbe in the Gersa Teshuvah. Yeah, what were you about to say? Right. Okay. So we're actually going to touch on that a little bit, and it's going to come out from the Alter Rebbe. The Rebbe is going to say that the Alter Rebbe is going to fit in best with this third explanation that we're about to say. But the truth is, you could even learn that in the second part. Because Alter Rebbe doesn't say you should count it as a separate mitzvah. He says, Iker mitzvah shuv is azivus achet. But azivus achet is a mitzvah kelola. So therefore, you can't count it part of 613. So even with Alter Rebbe, you could bring it in. I think the Rebbe brings the Alter Rebbe in the second one, that he says that you could say it even according to the Alter Rebbe, I think. Anyway, let's see further in Gimel. Bekirya Sefer, Maitik Loshna Rambam, Bekaiseres LeHilchas Teshuvah. In Hilchas Teshuvah, in the Mishnah Torah and the Yad HaChazakah, there is a title. So the Rebbe assures us that the titles were also written by the Rambam. So therefore, it has the same validity. You could learn out pshat in the Rambam from the titles as well. Shegam heim nichtav de Rambam, he says over here. Sheyoshuv hachoyte mechete lifnei Hashem v'yisvada. What does this mean? He says that is a mitzvah. Umefarish hatshuvah v'aviduy mitzvah achas. The Kirya Sefer says mitzvah echadi. On the bottom it says achas. She'ein viduy beli teshuvah. Why? Ki mi shemesvada ve'ein goymer belibay loshuv mechatosay hu kitoivel v'sheretz biyadai. Ukimhuva b'Rambam Hilchos Teshuvah Perek Beis, that the Rambam himself says this expression, that it's considered someone that says viduy, but he doesn't really regret, and he doesn't leave the chet behind. He's ketovel v'sheretz b'yadin. The Rebbe is going to make a big emphasis from this example, because we're going to see something very interesting from this example.
You got your answer here.
V'haviduy hu gemar hatshuvah biur dvarav. Teshuvah v'viduy hem shnei chalokim shel mitzvah achas. Two sides of the same coin. Teshuvah hi chelek hamachshava sheba hagemira belev lazev shelo yaseu oid. V'viduy hu chelek hadibor beloshna Rambam shetzarech liisvadis besfasav v'loymar inyonis elu shegamer beliboy. The Rambam himself connects it and says, what am I saying in Viduy? In Viduy, I'm saying those very things that I made up in my heart. The Rebbe is going to say this is mamish like we find by davening. Davening is according to the Rambam especially, is about serving Hashem. Va'avatem es Hashem. It's something that goes on in the heart and mind. Except I need to vocalize it. I need to express it with my lips. I need to be mevatet b'svasov. So in Sefer Hamitzvos, all he says is lehispalel. But in Mishnah Torah, in the Yad HaChazakah, he goes into more detail that it's lavoy, mischanen lefnei Hashem. It's not just about saying the words. But in Sefer Hamitzvos, where he's just going to the crux, what's the mitzvah itself? So he says, saying the words of davening. But saying the words of davening means it's the other half of having that feeling that you're talking to Hashem and you're asking Hashem for your needs. He's going to bring this example in a moment. The same thing, Teshuvah. Teshuvah is something going on in my heart, and that very thing that I said, that I thought in my heart, I express it with Viduy. Hainu levate b'svas mashnikbar b'liboy v'alpiza move on shemitzvahs Viduy keilelas hachoyva loshuv shari b'liat Teshuvah b'lev ein toichen leviduy. The whole Viduy is worthless. V'alpiza move on atam shehevia Rambam dugma. Even halacha beis, he says it. Halacha gimel, I'm sorry. So the Rebbe asks, why? What does the Rambam help by bringing emotion? Again, the Rambam is a halacha sefer. He's trying to bring down things like halacha. He doesn't bring down extra flowery, poetic things just to bring in Mamor Chazal or something. He's trying to explain something about Teshuvah and Viduy by giving this example. The question is, why is it necessary to give this example?
You can't say also it's a kavanah that. The same way it's doing and kavanah.
That's what I'm saying. But not all mitzvahs, the doing and kavanah are interconnected.
Right, you don't need
That's what I'm saying. That's why I gave an example of tefillah. Later on, he's going to say in a footnote, learning Torah Shabbat Peh without understanding what you're saying. So again, They're saying the words, and then there's the understanding what you're saying. It's part and parcel of the same mitzvah. Bash'ain can't film without kavanah, that's already something else. But there's certain mitzvahs that the kavanah and the action go hand in hand. The lachura ma tzoydech bedugmazu v'havel leil meimer stam sheviduy beli azivas achet ein moyel el shedugmazu mevaeres geder atshuva kishem shetoyvel v'sheretz biyadoi ein kan inyan stadi agoyim shetvil loy toyel. What kind of things is called an inyan stadi that the tefillah does not help? K'may chatzitza. If a person has something, shmutz or something stuck to their hand, to their foot, whatever, a part of their body, and they go to the mikveh, it's not a good tefillah. Why? Because it's blocking. Does it mean that the etzem tefillah is something wrong? No, the problem is there's something blocking, not allowing the water to get there. Or the person goes to the mikveh not at the time they were supposed to go, like there's when the person's supposed to go to the mikveh is at the conclusion of the days that he's supposed to be tummy. If he went the middle of the days that he's supposed to be tummy, so then he didn't go to the mikveh in the right time. But it's not that the actual tevilah was not a tevilah. The problem is that he did it at the wrong time. But if a person is toivel v'sheretz biyada, it's not a side problem. Elazel heipich inyan atvilah. This is contradictory. You can't have tumah and tefillah at the same time. The same thing. Azivas hatuma and litoyer v'tumah. How can you have that together with holding on to the sheretz when you have to do with the tumah? So the Rebbe says this is the exact same thing. This is what the Rambam is saying. It's the exact same thing when it comes to Viduy and Teshuvah. If a person doesn't do Teshuvah and says Viduy, it's Toivel v'sheretz biyadei. Why? It's the opposite of the whole Viduy. And if you don't have one, so then it's like Toivel v'sheretz biyadei.
It's very strong connection.
Right. If so, let's go back. And I already gave you the insight to the answer before, outside. But let's go back to Sefer Hamitzvos. If we're saying Teshuvah and Viduy are two halves of the same mitzvah, so why Taka in Sefer Hamitzvos doesn't even mention anything about Teshuvah? All he says, Mitzvah Ayin Gimel, is mitzvah number 73, is just to say Viduy. If the whole Viduy is worthless without the Teshuvah, why doesn't he say anything about Teshuvah? Vatam shebe Sefer Hamitzvos, Hiskar Rambam Rak Mitzvahs Viduy, V'lo Hiskar Achoy V'lasas Teshuvah. That's the main mitzvah. The Viduy is only the expression of it. The main thing is about actually leaving the chet. So it seems to be as if ha'ikar chasam ha'sefer. The Rambam Sefer Hamitzvos is leaving out the main point. The main point is the Teshuvah. The Viduy is only you're expressing it. So why does the Rambam leave it out and say for Hamitzvos? Mitzvah sheyesh b'shnei chalakim, machshava v'dibrei ma'aser. Any mitzvah that has machshava on one side and another half of the mitzvah is either speech or action. Nimna b'minyan hamitzvos inyan hadibur v'ma'aser sheba v'loy inyan hamachshava sheba.
Even if the machshava is the main intent.
Even if machshava is the main intent. The Rebbe says in the footnote, Al Chassidus, because since the main thing is that the mitzvah is to bring down the lakus into this physical world, and how do you bring down the lakus in the physical world? That's through a physical action, or at least akim asfas of havamais, like we learned today, that the actual movement of the lips is also considered an action. So that is the main part that we actually count in the mitzvah, even though the real truth of the mitzvah in some mitzvahs is the machshava. And he gives the example I mentioned before, Uldugma, mitzvah's tefillah. Shumurkeves mishnei chalokim. Avoida shebalev. K'maimer chazal eizehi avoida shebalev zu tefillah. And in addition to that, there is v'dibur tefillah. Got to say the words. V'afal pi she'ikerin tefillah. Hu lo yadibur ela machshava kavan salev. We had this in one of the sichos that we were learning sometime over here. I don't remember which week, but we were talking about it, that the Rambam and the Reb Chaim emphasized this, that according to the Rambam, the main part of mitzvah of davening is the thought that I'm thinking. I'm talking to Hashem. I'm thinking. I'm asking Hashem for my request. Except, how do I do it? I have to say it with my mouth. It's not like other mitzvahs that the kavanah is an additional thing. The kavanah in tefillah is part of the mitzvah itself. Va'ad shetefillah she'ena b'kavanah hainu ha'kavanah ha'klolus ki goyin dalef ne'miyat ha'oimid v'chiyotz b'zeh eina tefillah. U'b'mokim acher nisboyer dikar l'lashon Rambam hilchos tefillah chiyuv mitzvah zu kachi she'adam mischanen u'mispal b'chol yoyim. Why does the Rambam add the word mischanen? Why doesn't it just say chiyuv atfilah is a person should daven every day? Because if you say mispalel, you could just think it's talking about saying the words. But mischanen shows that it's an inner feeling of the heart. I'm begging, I'm speaking to Hashem, I'm asking from Hashem what I need. In other words, according to the Rambam, the main thing is the internal experience, what's going on inside. Shegeder shel mitzvah tefillah hu biduy shel regesh mesuyam bedibur. Ubeli hergish shel tchina ein mashmos ba'amiras tevis atfilah. You're just saying words of davening without knowing what you're saying, without thinking that you're talking to the Eibishter. The whole tefillah it's like the Viduy without the Teshuvah. You're just saying words. Mikol makim nechsheves mitzvahs tefillah kemitzvah shebedibur. Even though speech is not the main thing, even though the main thing is the hergish alev. V'zeu pashtus pirush haloshon yispalel shekoy al dibur shebetefillah. So when you look in the minyan mitzvahs of the Rambam under tefillah, you don't find chanun, you don't find kavanah, you don't find liroy sha'im lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu or avodas Hashem or anything like that. What does it say? Ube'minyan mitzvahs shebereish sefer hayad Naked Rambam lispalel olav v'chein bereishachas tefillah mitzvahs aseh lispalel b'chol yom. Ki b'minyan ha-mitzvahs moinim es inyan ha-dibur shebetefillah v'loi as ha-kavanah sheba. And in footnote 27 he says what I mentioned before about learning also. In Torah Sheba'al Peh, a person does not fulfill the obligation of learning Torah Sheba'al Peh unless he understands it. By Torah Sheba'Ksav, if I read words of Tillim or Chumash, even if I don't understand it, if he's an Amoritz and he can't understand it, so he's yoyed to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. But Torah Sheba'al Peh, if I say Mishnayos and I don't understand what I'm saying, if I say Gemara and I don't understand what I'm saying, I wasn't yoyed to the mitzvah. On the other hand, even when I do understand, I'm supposed to say the words of Torah out in speech. And so on, to be able to fulfill this idea of bringing Torah down into the world, to be able to make a dira b'tachtonim. The Rebbe says in Tanya, we need to say the words of Torah, not just understand it in our mind. So it's another example of something that the thought and the speech are two halves of the same whole. Okay, so now the Rebbe is going to say, of these three explanations, either that Teshuvah is not a mitzvah like the Minchas Chinuch, or the Teshuvah is a mitzvah kelelas, so even though it's a mitzvah, but the Rambam is not going to number it in one of the 630 mitzvahs, or that Teshuvah and Viduy are two halves of the same mitzvah, and the Rambam is only counting the part of the mitzvah that involves speech or action. So the Rebbe says, "V'nei derech haniglam megimel biyurim anal nira yoser habir ashlish." Why? So he says, "Dihina shitas haminchas chinuch shal Rambam ein chayv alasis tshuva kasha." It's difficult to say that. Sharei b'keseres lehilchas tshuva mefurish kanal mitzvah esa achas v'ushi yoshev achoyte mechetel fnei Hashem v'yisvada. So it's very clear that the Rambam holds that it's a mitzvah aseh. Harei shegam la Rambam yesh mitzvah loshev mechetel. V'cheinokat gam rabbeinu azokin begeres hatshuva shaloi shekosav mitzvah hatshuva. Well, the Rebbe says he doesn't say inyan hatshuva and muhus hatshuva, which actually in the geres hatshuva, the Alter Rebbe uses also the terms inyan hatshuva, muhus hatshuva, because he's talking about different components of tshuva. But when he talks about the mitzvah of tshuva, the Alter Rebbe in the geres hatshuva says, what is it? That mitzvah hatshuva min ha-Torah hi aziv zachet bolvad. So you see, in the category of what's called a mitzvah, it's the idea of tshuva, leaving the sin. The viduy is just another component. Harei sheyesh mitzvah min ha-Torah loshev mechetoi. V'koi sham b'shittas Rambam. Maybe you'll say the Alter Rebbe is going according to some other shittas. So we can see, can muchach mehemshach dvarav, the Alter Rebbe over there quotes different things of the Rambam to say what the definition of Teshuvah is, that you don't have to fast. There's no mitzvah of fasting as being part of Teshuvah. He brings to the Rambam. So you see that the Alter Rebbe is going in the shit of the Rambam. And while going in the shit of the Rambam, he says, mitzvah Teshuvah is aziv sachet bolvad. So you see that the Alter Rebbe learns out in the Rambam that even the Teshuvah itself, not the Viduy, even the Teshuvah itself is already a mitzvah. So that's why the gang of the Michnas Chinuch is not something that makes so much sense al pi nigel. V'gam habir habeiz hanal, she'atshuvah hi matzivui makoilim she'ein b'hem ma'aseh miyuchad, doichek l'chura, ki b'tshuvah tzarech liyes, lo yirak aziv asachet kabol al haba, ela gam charot al ha'avar, k'ma shekosva Rambam, u'maya tshuvah, hu she'yazev ha'choyte chetoi, which means for the future, he leaves it. I'm not going to do it anymore. But also, the Rambam says, v'chein yisnachem al she'avar, charot al ha'avar. Charot al ha'avar hu ma'aseh miyuchad she'ein yodim oiseh mitzvos acheres. What are you telling me? You're telling me that, you remember we said, if there's something that this mitzvah doesn't tell us something new that we didn't know from other mitzvahs, so then it's called a tzivui koil. So it says, I'll say, Kedoshim Tiyu. Yes, Kedoshim Tiyu. I don't eat chazer. I'm Kaddish. I'm not Shotav Ba'arayis. I'm a Kaddish. I don't eat treif. I'm a Kaddish. It's not something new. But Charot al ha'avar, we know that you have to be, from all the mitzvahs, we have to be committed to Hashem. And we have to do all the mitzvahs. But we don't know from other mitzvahs that you have to have charot on something you did wrong. So since part of Teshuvah, even without Viduy, is charot al ha'avar, so that's already something new. If it's something new, you can't say it's a tzivui koilel. If you can't say it's a tzivui koilel, so then Teshuvah should have been a separate mitzvah, one out of the 613, because it has this special thing. Just like you're making Viduy into a special mitzvah, because you wouldn't know from anywhere else that you have to do Viduy when you do something wrong. The same thing you wouldn't know from anywhere else that you have to have Charot when you did something wrong. So he says, "B'doichek yesh loymar shecharot al ha'avar hiprat b'kabola al ha'haba." You know what? We know that a person has to accept upon himself to do all the mitzvahs. But if a person did wrong, so it's obvious. How am I accepting new mitzvahs if I didn't have charot yet on what I did before? Yeah, you're accepting to do the mitzvahs? What about what you did yesterday? What about what you did an hour ago? So obviously, if you're accepting to do the mitzvahs, it has to include charot al ha'avar. V'lechein ein ha'charot nechshavas ma'aseh miyuchad kivin shemochrachasi la'kabala la'haba. That's why we may say that it's still considered a tzivui koilo. But he says, "Aval zeu doiche gadol ki bedinei hatshuvah hamuva'arim b'shulchan aruch shal yodam b'rosho nasa kosher la'edus." There is actually special halachas of teshuvah that matter in Shulchan Aruch, in practical ma'aser v'poil. In Shulchan Aruch, there's no separate hilchos teshuvah, but there is about certain persons that are apostle edus because they're considered a Rasha. Al Tashis Yad Rasha Eid. You cannot make a Rasha a witness. So there's certain people that are called a Rasha. When do they lose that title of Rasha? So in Choshen Mishpat, in the halachas of Eidus, where it talks about who can be an Eid, who not can be an Eid, so it talks about how the person becomes a Rasha. But how am I going to get rid of the Rasha? So it talks about the halachas of Teshuvah. It's negeya that a person should be removed from being a Rasha. So he says, what does it say over there in Shulchan Aruch? It doesn't say anything about charot al ha'avar. Rak kabola al haba. If he did certain things which make him pasul ha'edus, and we know that he accepted upon himself for the future, through Bezdin, whatever, not to do this anymore, he doesn't have to express to Bezdin that he had charot al ha'avar. All we have to know is that he has taken upon himself not to do it in the future. That's enough considered teshuvah that he's able to be kosher la'edus. ומשמע זה שאפשר לגמר בלב שלם שמכאן ולהבא יקיים מצווה השם מבלי להרגיש צער וחרט על העבר. It's not necessary to be able to have a true Kabbalah lahaba with only if you have charata. You can have it even without having charata. V'chein moira pashtas lashon Rambam v'chein yisnachem al sha'avar. We said before from the Rambam, you have to be yoshev achoyte mechetoi. That's the idea of Kabbalah lahaba. V'chein, and also yisnachem, you should have regret. If you're telling me it's really the same thing, the proof that you have Kabbalah lahaba is the fact that you had charata al-avar. So why is the Rambam divided like into two parts? That he leaves his Aveda behind and he regrets. It's the same thing. It's part of the same thing. It shouldn't be and also or so too he regrets. It should make it part of one thing. So we see from the Rambam, she'einei t'nai beprat be'azivus achet. It's not part of it, ela inyan noisef. And then the Rebbe goes on to say, u'ba'omek yosem niraloymer shegam azivas achet gemiras v'kabolas halev ala haba nechsheves kedever shelo yadanu mitzvos acheres. Ki eine doima hakabola shebetshuvah lakabolas el mach shemayim stam. What the Rebbe said, why the second pirush was not good enough, is because charot ala avar is something new. So the Rebbe, but Kabbalah lahaba is really part of all the other mitzvahs that I accept upon myself to do mitzvahs. But the Rebbe says that really the commitment to do good in the future after a person did Teshuvah is really a much more deeper Kabbalah so Mach Shemayim than all the other mitzvahs. So you could say even that is a Chiddush, and it's not part of mitzvah Koilulim, and therefore it would have to have its own mitzvah sasi. So based on all these reasons, V'lechein nira bir hagimel anal, what you like very much, Rabbi Davis, that the third explanation is the reason why the Rambam does not count Teshuvah in the Sefer Hamitzvos. Shatam shatshuvah eina nimnes v'minyan hamitzvos hu lefi she'inyan shebalev. Or v'minyan hamitzvos nimna rak chelak hadibur shebamitzvah zu, dahainu mitzvos viduy. Okay. Now we finished with the nigla part. Now he's going to say something amazing. If we have all these three views in nigla, even though the final view is the third one, but still in all, al pi pnimis and yonim, and to give us an insight into what Teshuvah is about, we could learn out from all these three approaches. Let's see it inside. Amnam. Mikim shegimel biurim elu hem svaras b'toiram, yesh loymar shecholim aleim divrei chazal elu ve'elu divrei l'kim chayim. O k'mayshin izboyer kam ap'amim shekol deya b'toira. Gam deya shel halacha nidchasa. Yesh lo makim ba'avodas Hashem. Just as an example, I think I've mentioned this before. Chassidus brings down that there is an idea that the shofar has to be straight. La halacha, there's machlokes. There's an opinion in Gemara that holds that the shofar should be curved, like we have a shofar, but there's an opinion in Gemara to have the shofar straight. So Chassidus learns out Ahira and Avodas Hashem from the shofar being straight, even though halacha is that the shofar has to be bent. And another Amar Chassidus will bring the Ahira from the fact that the shofar is bent. Since it's Elu Ve'elu Divrei L'kim Chayim, all things have their Ahira Beruchnius. We will even see in Chassidus things that we learn out, or things that we derive from the Siddur, that we don't say in our Siddur. In Siddur, Tils Hashem, in the Chabad Siddur, we don't say it. And still in all, it brings it down. Why? Because even though the Poil we don't say it, Beruchnis and Yonim, it's correct. It's just that we don't say it for whatever reason. It says, the Zeshin, if Skala Allah Gedeya Echad, Hurak Lanhoge B'maise, why? Ki Yef Shalom B'maise, Geshtei Deya Soisris. Aber wenn ich gehe, Leruchnis HaMitzvos, Yesh Mokim L'chol Dadeyes. V'chein Beniden the Dam. Shegimel HaShittas HaNal Bin Teshuvah. The first one is, Teshuvah Ein HaMitzvah, Kishittas HaMinchas Chinuch. Beis, the second explanation is, Hi Mitzivui Makoli. Gimel, Hi HaMitzvah Protis, Kichol HaMitzvahs.
You have on the pages.
22.
וזה שאין נמנס ומן המצווה הוא מפני שנמנה חלק הדיבר שבו ולא אין התשובה שבלב יש למוקים על פי תוכן הרוחני שבמצווה תשובה all three approaches. V'yuven zeh behegdem bir ma'amar Razal. Sharamach mitzvahs asi, v'shasam mitzvahs loises, hem keneged ramach evarim v'shasa gidim. V'yadua, the geshem shaguf mischalak ramach evarim v'shasa gidim, kach yesh kenegdam taryag mine koiches v'chayes min neshama. V'kasher ha'adam hu sholem b'shmiras kol ha'taryag mitzvahs, shehem keneged ramach evarim v'shasa gidim, the gashmiastike evarim and gidim, Azu tamim v'shalom b'chol evari hanefesh, ma she'enkin im chiser mitzvah achas pogam ba, harinasem b'chuser eiver. And that's the pshat, if you remember, we had in the Eftesacha, tamim tiyeh Hashem alakecha. If you're with Hashem alakecha, you have to be whole and complete. How is a yid whole and complete? When every one of his limbs and gidim of his neshama are complete. Why? Because I did all the mitzvahs, so then I can be complete and be one with Hashem. So v'zeu inyana shel mitzvahs teshuvah shehi b'madrega el yoyne yoyser mekol ha-mitzvahs shelachein b'koicha l'malas habgam v'chasaron shenasa beivori v'chayis ha-neshama. The Alter Rebbe says this in Likutei Torah. V'ayin lefi sha'idei ha-teshuvah me'umked liba magim le'etzem ha-nefesh shu moker ha-chayis shel eivori ha-neshama v'sham me'ikara loy magia p'gam shel chatoim. The neshama was still faithful with Hashem. So even though the neshama did something wrong, and there's a pagam in the koiches and chayes of the neshama, that's only in the koiches of the neshama. It's only in the chayes of the neshama, not the etzma neshama. So when the person reaches deep inside of himself, touches his own essence of his neshama, so then he draws down v'lachein nimshach misham chayis chadash la'ever ha'pagum l'malis hapgam v'chisaron that the person did in his koyach and in his chayis. Do you see already where he's going with this? It doesn't have to do, Teshuvah doesn't have to do with the 613 different parts of the neshama. It's beyond all the 613 parts of the neshama. That's why it can fix them. The reason why I can fix any part in the neshama that's broken is because it's totally higher than it. It's not part of the number of 613. Valpiza moving tam hashita shemitzvos teshuvah yimetzivuim hakolim ve'eina nimnes b'minyan hamitzvos ki atam shetzivuyim kolim lo nimnu b'minyan hamitzvos lefi sheminyan hamitzvos nimnu rak mitzvos shem keneged evarim pratim shal neshama ve'lo tzivuyim hakolim kol hamitzvos kulam. So therefore, where it says "Kedoshim Tiyu" or "Ves Mitzvosai Tishmeiru," all those are very general things. It's not a particular aver. It's not a particular part of the neshama. Val derech birad marazakim ba'chiluk shebein Torah mitzvos. The mitzvos nikroyos evarim v'ilu ha'Torah she'amakir shekol mitzvos. How do we know what a mitzvah is? How do we know how to do a mitzvah? You have to look in Torah. So the Torah is the shayrish of the mitzvahs. It's the source of the mitzvahs. He bechinas hadam hamamshech chayis l'chol evarim b'shava b'chlalusa. Just like the blood travels around the entire body and gives energy to the entire body, so to Torah is the general thing that gives energy and life to all the mitzvahs. V'cheinu b'negel l'mitzvah teshuvah shehi madregel yoyne yoyser mekol ha-mitzvahs ki inyana lahamshech chayis chodesh be'ever ha-nivkam Harei eina b'minyan ha-mitzvah shekeneged evari ha-nefesh el l'mayla mehem v'shayeches l'dam v'chayis ha-nefesh. V'atam, if so, why is Teshuvah different than Viduy? Sherak mitzvahs ha-Teshuvah lo nimnes b'minyan ha-mitzvahs. Aval mitzvahs Viduy hi b'minyan ha-mitzvahs. Yesh loymar ki koyach ha-Teshuvah l'malas habgam be'evari ha-neshama Huayidei ha'achlota v'ayisoyrus me'umke de liba shimagas me'etzma nefesh kanal ve'inyan zeh shayich l'inyan ha'teshuvah shebelev v'loi viduy dvarim. What did we say before? To draw down that power, to fix up the koiches of the nefesh, a person needs to drill very deep inside of themselves. Viduy is not that tool. The teshuvah me'umke de liba is that tool. That's the heart part of teshuvah. Not the hard part. It's also the hard part. But it's the heart part of Teshuvah. It's the dover klali of Teshuvah. Mashenkin Viduy, that's not the depth that reaches all the way to the highest level. It's beyond the taryag koiches of the nefesh that needs to fix them. So therefore, Viduy can be considered one of the 613 mitzvahs. But the Teshuvah part, the Oimek HaNefesh part, that's beyond all the 613 koiches. Therefore, it's beyond all the 613 mitzvahs. Al pi Agdam Mezu yesh levayer al pi pnimis hanyonim gam tam shitas haminchas chinuch sheteshuvah ein a mitzvah klal. We use this to explain the second opinion, that it's a mitzvah kolelis, it's from the mitzvah's kolim. But he didn't really explain the mitzvah, the shita of the minchas chinuch. It still should be a mitzvah. So the minchas chinuch holds it's not even a mitzvah. So he says, Ka'amr li'il, ha'koyach shebetshuvah l'malis ha'pkam v'cheson shebe'evorei ha'nefeshu lefi sheteshuvah magia be'etzem ha'nefesh, like we said before, moker ha'chayis she'evorei ha'nefesh kanal. V'inyonim haboim me'etzem ha'nefesh tluyim ach v'rak bebchiras ha'adam. The kasher adam oised davar te ha'hechrech hari ein pnimius nafshi ba'asiyazu. If he's forced, a person put a gun to his head. It doesn't have to be a literal gun, but there's something that's forcing the person to do it. It's not true bechira. It says even if let's say I choose to eat meat and not chicken because I like meat, so it's like I'm forced to do it because I like the meat. That's why I'm eating the meat. True choice is if I have no preference of meat over chicken, and still I take the meat, or still I take the chicken. That's true bechira. So he says, "V'rak asiyach chitzonis bolvad," if the person is being forced. Umuved shekechol shemismayet hahechrech min b'chutz yesh yoser pnimius ba'asiyah. There's all different types of levels in this. One could be an actual gun to their head, and one could be something else that's like not a gun to their head, but something is motivating them, something is forcing them to do it. But if you totally remove everything, then you have the truth b'chira chavshus. He says, "Va'inyan sheba me'etzem ha'nefesh mamish shalamayla mechal ha'koiches v'chulu u'mepnei sheba kuloi ach v'rak mebchiras ha'adam bli simon v'chutz." ועל דרך מה שנסבור במקום אחר, שזהו גם הטעם לגודל השמחה של ניסח המים בחג הסוכות, שהוא הלכה למוישה מסיני, שאינו מפורש בהדיו בתורה שבכתב. It doesn't say anywhere that you pour water on the mizbeach on sukkos. Throughout the Torah, where it talks about karbanos, it says about pouring the wine on the mizbeach. Nothing about water on sukkos. Rak rabbanon asmachu akroi, they brought a remes from the pasuk, but really it's halacha l'moish mesinai. So since it's not open in the Torah, so that evokes a greater simcha because it's almost like we're not that much forced to do it. The simcha of Beis HaSheva, the simcha of Nischa Mayim was greater than the general simcha of Yom Tov. Because simcha of Yom Tov says openly in the Torah, v'samachta b'chagecha. Nischa Mayim, it doesn't say anywhere in the Torah openly to do it. So that's why it actually brings out a greater simcha. Because it's coming from me, not because of something that's telling me to do it. V'simcha shal hakafas, which means Atzeres Simchas Torah, the Rebbe always talks about it. She'eina afilu chiyuv medivri soifrim. Nowhere in Gemara, nowhere in Mamor Chazal does it talk about the mitzvah of hakafas. Can you imagine that? We think about hakafas such a basic thing. Nothing. It's a Ramah. El minig Yisrael, G'doyloi Yosef K'minig Yisrael, afilu mesimchas Beis HaSheva. The simcha of this minig of hakafas is even greater than simchas Beis HaSheva. There is actually, the Rebbe explains, I was learning a sikha from Shavuos Tafshin Lamed Gimel, and the Rebbe started talking about the simcha of Zman Matan Tereseinu, and then he started talking about the simcha of those going on talucha because they are going to be misamech other yidden, and the Rebbe brings this idea in that the simcha that comes from something that you're not commanded, he brings in nischa mayim, and he brings in hakafis, and then he says, Zolishhabim faribel shouldn't have any tightness like that to me, but I would say, since talucha is not even a minig that says in Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, whatever, therefore it's higher, and therefore the simcha of talucha, of going on talucha, should be even greater than the simcha even of hakafis. Amazing what the Rebbe says over there. That's it. Anyway, so it's explained why tak is something that doesn't say in Shulchan Aruch, something that's only a minig, a greater simcha. The here understands kishachol shasimcha muka gedol yoser kach mismayet toikef achiyuv ki kasher yesh tzivui ala adam הרי זה גופה כמו סיבה מבחוץ, שכאילו מכריחה אויסי לעשות מה שנצטווה. ולכן ככל שמסמאי תוקף החיוב, הרי השמחה שבלב היא פנימיוס יויסר ומקוירה בעומק הנפש. וכן הוא בעניין התשובה. דחיב שהתשובה שלמה ואמיתיס. Ba'me'etzma nefesh. Like we said before, Sharak, Misham, when you're dealing with etzma nefesh, Nim shachayis chadash, Lamalis habgam be'ivori nefesh, because that's how deep you have to go to fix up the koichs nefesh that got messed up. L'chein ain't tzivui al mitzvah zu, like the Minchas Chinuch says. It's not a mitzvah. It's beyond a mitzvah. כי רק כשהאדם עושה תשובה בבחירוסי החופשי לגמרי, אפילו לא ימח מסיבי התורה, הרי זה ראיה שהתשובה היא מעומקת הליבה ועצם הנפש ממש. So instead of looking at what the Minchas Chinuch says as like shocking and like making tshuva something cheap, adrabah, the Minchas Chinuch's approach that he says that tshuva is not even a mitzvah is really raising up tshuva to the most highest level. I'm not doing tshuva because I have to, because the Torah tells me to do tshuva. I'm doing tshuva because from the depth of my nefesh, I feel the need to return to the Eibishter. Val Pizeh, the Rebbe says also another amazing thing. Yesh levair gamatam sha Rambam hichnis ha'ikir de b'chira chavshis behilchus tshuva davke. The Rambam discusses the idea that a person has free choice. It's one of the Yud Gimel Ikrim. Where does he put it in? There's different places where the Rambam talks about what a person has to believe. Right away. In Mada, in Hilchas Deis, he right away over there, right away in the beginning, he talks about Mi Yisoidei Akel, Mi Yisoidei Adas, Leida Shakel, etc. There are certain basics of Yiddishkeit that he discusses right at the beginning. But where does he talk about Bechira Chavshis? Free choice. Should be like a basic thing. He should discuss this right away at the beginning in Hilchas Deis. He doesn't discuss it in Hilchas Deis. He discusses this in Hilchas Teshuvah. Because we're going to say now, true Teshuvah is coming out of Bechira Chavshis. And that's why Bechira Chavshis belongs in Hilchas Teshuvah. The Afal Pishu Iker Gadol Bechira Chavshis, Vu Ahmed Atayra Mitzvah, to know that he believes in free will. Hainu Ahmed Kol Atayra Mitzvahs. V'lachayra Havali Lavia B'Hilchas Yisoidei Atayra. Hilchas Yisoidei Atayra means I'm sorry, I was saying Hilchas Deis. I meant Hilchas Yisoidei Torah. The foundations, the principles on what the whole Torah stands. And if the Rambam says that Bechira Chavshis is the Iker and Yisoid of Kol Torah mitzvahs, so it should be in the halachs of Yisoidei Torah. Why does he put it in Hilchas Teshuvah? Ki inyan ha-Bechira Chavshis shayich leguf asiyas Teshuvah. Lefisha Teshuvah shleima hi kishaba me'etzma nefesh kanal. והבחינה על עניין הבא מעצם הנפש היא כשבא כתיצא מבחירה חופשס לגמרי בלי סיבה בחוץ. מה שאין כן בשאר המצווה שעניין הבחירה נגיע רק לנסחר ועונש כמו שנסבר במקום אחר. I would go into it, but we're running a little bit over time. אף על פי כן, שיטת הרמב"ם והאדמו"ר הזקן להלכה היא, despite everything we just now said, היא שתשובה היא מצווה. ואויד זוי שהיא מצווה פרטיס, הנמנם במיני המצווה שהיא חלק המצווה וידוי. אלא שזו במחשב וזו בדיבור כנ"ל, like we said before. So how does this fit in? We just now explained how wonderful it is to say that Teshuvah is higher than all the mitzvahs. So why does the Rambam openly say it's a mitzvah? Why does the Alter Rebbe openly say that it's a mitzvah? Seemingly we just now explained it's so much greater if we say that Teshuvah is beyond being a mitzvah. So he's saying the purpose of Teshuvah is not to be out of this world, but to be in this world. And that's expressed when Teshuvah is a mitzvah. The famous question is, why does it say Teshuvah u'maisim tovim? It's to say first maisim tovim, because maisim tovim comes first. And if a person does something wrong, then afterwards he has to do Teshuvah. You don't start off doing Teshuvah. You have to start off doing maisim tovim. If I didn't do maisim tovim, so there's plan B. I could fix it up. I could do Teshuvah. So why say Teshuvah and then maisim tovim? No, but it still doesn't fit in. Teshuvah has to be after. Teshuvah is plan B. Maisim tovim is plan A. Shaydei HaTeshuvah, Chassidus explains, Nasim Maiseh Adam Maisim Tovim Umeirim. We know Tov has to do with oir, like it says, vayar v'hina abai, it's malekulit oira, that he saw Moshe Rabbeinu was toiv, and says vayar oir ki toiv. So we see that toiv shows an oir, so that the maisim, the mitzvahs that I do, should be illuminated and shining mitzvahs. It's when it's preceded by tshuva. Ki tshuva machnisa chayis b'kiyum haTorah mitzvahs. Ve'in ze davar noisev bin tshuva, that it brings in chayis into the mitzvahs. El zoya tachlis v'matorah shel tshuva lahavias ha'adam l'tisefes chayis ba'avidose b'kiyum haTorah mitzvahs. Kiloyim. Tchunas hatshuva hi she yichayla lahavias ha'adam l'deiratzen livroyach min ha'olam hazeh sherubik kol ha'avar shoyim goyvrim by. We see some people like that. When they do tshuva, they want to go lock themselves up. They run away to Eretz Yisrael. They run away in yeshiva, and they don't want to leave kollel or whatever. That's what, because you see how lousy this world is. You see how lousy Gashmias is. You want to run away from it. The lachrish adam nichshel barasha ba'olam umargish goydel b'chisusay harei ba'asiyas tshuva misoyre ba'aratzen livroich min ha'olam shu maves v'rav v'losh v'lashem kipshutay v'aruach tosh v'lakim asher nasana. Literally, that's what he's saying, kipshutay. Literally, he wants to leave this world. He wants to leave his physical body. Why should I deal with the terrible things going on in this world? She is charet kol kach al ma'aseh hara sheloi v'nisoyre b'yatshuka liparid ma'arasha b'olam hazeh, till he actually did that. Ad sheyasa nishmaseh.
What's the goal of that? What's it?
He expired. The God means he cried out in Bechia till he expired. No, not from the word Vayigva. It's a term like a cow. It says also the word God. It's not in a way of running away from this world, but rather he brings also, there's some that say that he actually didn't pass away. He wanted to pass away, but he didn't actually leave this world. The Arizal has a very big question. How would Rabbi Elazar ben Adai, that didn't do any mitzvahs all of his life, how was he zoichet to Gan Eden? Shaloi sigel ma'asim tovim heich ba'olam haba ba'meh yiskasa she'ein adam yachol lekol shamim loyal levush adasam ma'asim tovim. We had this in Tanya, that the mitzvahs are garments to protect him and to enable him. We had this not too long ago in Tanya, to be able to receive the great light of the Eibush in Gan Eden. He needs like protective gear. The levushim come from the mitzvahs. How can Rabbi Elazar ben Adai, even though he did this amazing tshuva, how can he go into Gan Eden? He didn't have mitzvahs. But the Arizal answers, Elazel Gilgul Yochanan Kohen Gadol Sheshimish Peishan Bekohen Gedoyla or Lebasayf Nasitz Duki. So therefore, all of the mitzvahs that he did when he was Yochanan Kohen Gadol, now we're able to act as the levushim for him in Gan Eden. Halavush Asan Yochanan Kohen Gadol B'chol Ma'asim Tovim Asher Sigel Peishanim Lokha Rabbi Elazar. So, but what is the point over here? Harei sheregish hatshuva lavad. It can't even bring him into Gan Eden. Ein b'koichei lahachnis ha'adam lo'olam haba v'tzrichim davke ma'asim tovim. V'zeu gam hatam ha'pnimi shegam hatshuva shebalevi mitzvah pratis ki bezeh boli de hadgosha ta'af al pi she'etzem inyana v'gidra hu l'mayla mekol ha'mitzvah so l'mayla min hatzivi b'chlal kanal. But along with that, you need to bring it down. Mikol mokum ein tshuva tzrich liyas ba'ifim shenishra l'mayla mitzvahs pratis deine rege shel charata v'ratza in losh v'al-Hashem ba'ifim klali ela h'slavas the tshuva tzarech liyas ba'ifim shetavias ha'adlam de tesefes chayis b'kir mitzvahs pratis v'idei zo l'saken apgam shebei vorei ha'nefesh tshuva ma'asim tovim davke.